the perfect is the enemy of the good. And what that means is we get caught up in trying to achieve perfection in everything we want to achieve. Like, well, as you were talking about with the podcast earlier, research the best guests, the best questions to ask, but then maybe not even get started. The better way to do it is to get started, then get good at something. So don't aim for perfection every time. Put together a product you might not be happy with, put it out into the world, get feedback, then improve. And that applies to any field. Thanks very much for having me, Sid. First time on the other side of the mic. So yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah, I was just mentioning to you that obviously you're the host of Launch Codes, and here and there you sort of reflect on your own experiences and drop a few nuggets here and there. So it's very it's a cool opportunity to sort of turn the tables and get to know you a bit more as well. So on the point of getting to know you a bit better, so I wanted to sort of kickstart the interview on that point and to give our audience a bit of an opportunity to get to know you better. So I find that a good place to start is in the later high school years. I think they can be particularly formative and instructive on, where a person ends up later on in their early university years, and also as they enter the early stages of whatever profession they're pursuing. So for those that don't know you, how would you describe your sort of later high school experience? Were you someone that was always academically inclined, or were your interests and passions existing outside the classroom?
Yeah, good question. I think I was definitely towards the academically inclined side. I think probably a bit too much. Like, I kind of sacrificed everything else that I was doing purely for the sake of academics. And I think if I had my time again, I probably would do that a little differently. So, not spend all day kind of buried in the books, but also, take time to either participate in community activities, exercise more, take part in more sports. I think I gave up all my, weekend cricket, music that I used to play, etc., just to focus on the studies. So I think in that sense, because of that, I guess I did pretty well in my HSC, but I came out of year 12 kind of not the most well-rounded. So I think I would have probably sacrificed a few ATAR points to keep those interests on the side if I had my time again.
100%. And to be honest with you, I was exactly the same. I was studying nonstop. I pretty much gave up everything else. And as you mentioned, if I had my time again, I might do things differently. I sort of wanted to follow that that question a bit more. Like, as you sort of transition to university, obviously you went to study at USyd. Like, did you find it difficult to flip that switch, to sort of broaden your horizons to that extent, or did it take you a bit of time to sort of make that transition, or not really?
Yeah, I think so. I think what really helped was just meeting other people at uni who'd done a variety of things. Like, I came from this selective school background where pretty much the only focus was academics. It might be a little harsh, but I think that was kind of the focus at selective schools. And then once you get to uni, you get to meet a diverse range of people, like, who've come from different backgrounds, played different sports, take part in different community events. And from that, I think I was able to see the value in that and really take part in things like student societies, get back into exercising, that kind of thing. So it didn't take too long to flip the switch because I had these kind of role models, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, and I definitely want to explore your university experience and some of the things that you've done at university, because I think that's really interesting. You also mentioned there that you went to a selective school. It was Baulkham Hills High School, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, and so as I mentioned to you off air, to my knowledge, we haven't had anyone who went to a selective school, and I think that's a big part of people's high school experience, particularly if you went to a selective school. So I wanted to sort of probe that a bit further. Like, you mentioned there that it's pretty much academically focused to the exclusion of everything else, but how would you describe your selective school experience? Quite an open-ended question for you.
Yeah. I guess on the whole, I really enjoyed high school. I think had a close group of friends that I still hang out with regularly even today. But yeah, so I guess on the pro side, academically, it's a great place to be. Like, people around you are very driven, and I guess that encourages you to focus on your studies as well. Also helps during the HSC in terms of the actual marks you get, because you might have heard this before, the better your school does, the better you do personally on your ATAR, because half your mark comes from basically your school activities. But yeah, I guess on the flip side, because everything is so academically driven, as I mentioned, everything else kind of falls by the wayside. And for better or for worse, that's just how it is. So yeah, I definitely don't like. I'm grateful that I went to a selective school because of that, like-minded individual aspect and the marks aspect. But there were some downsides as well.
Like as I touched on before, like I was also academically inclined, and after high school, I sort of had this crisis. I was like, well, shit, like I just worked my ass off for like 12 months. Like it doesn't really mean anything moving forward. Did you have a similar sentiment at all, or not really?
A little bit. I think, like, for example, the day the marks came out, I just looked at this piece of paper and saw like a good result. I was like, oh, like what's next kind of thing. And I think there's this concept, it's called the hedonic treadmill. Essentially, you kind of, even if you experience, great things in life, you get like this little spike in happiness, but then you kind of fall back to your baseline state. So let's say you win the lottery, like you get this massive spike in happiness, but then eventually just come down to this baseline state. And these like small goals, not small, but like goals you achieve aren't really going to increase that baseline state. It's more kind of things like meditation or close family and friends, fitness kind of thing that raises that baseline state.
Things of substance, right?
Yeah, probably irrelevant discussion, but
no.
I found that that concept definitely apply when it came to like marks.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can definitely resonate with that, particularly if they went to a selective school. And I just wanted to ask as well, like, what are some of the challenges that you face, at selective school? And are there a lot of challenges you think are consistent across selective school kids? Particularly like in a Launch Codes interview, you talked about sort of the narrow parts available to selective school students. Is that something that you think a lot of students might have as well and grapple with?
Yeah, I think so. I think what I was referring to was students tend to pick a very narrow set of subjects. So it'll be like 4 units of maths, three or 2 units of English, chemistry, economics, physics kind of thing, because they scale well, meaning that you don't have to raw marks wise do that well to get a good final mark in the HSC, and that's kind of like gold for selected school students. So I think in that sense, there's pressure amongst the peer group as well as parents and teachers to pick that narrow set of subjects, and I think it is felt across the selective school population. And you could argue like that's for the worst, right? That people don't choose a more diverse range of subjects. Like for example, under the software design course in my school had like 5 students, and the visual arts or design subjects had like 2 or 3 students. And you can argue that society is probably worse for that the young people aren't doing more diverse subjects, learning more and contributing, different things to society.
Yeah, 100%. And another thing I wanted to touch on sort of was that sort of transition to university. You mentioned it to me off air and how you sort of, it was characterized by a bit of uncertainty. So how would you sort of characterize that period for you? Did you know exactly what you wanted to do coming out of high school?
Yeah, definitely didn't. And I still don't really know what I'm going to be doing in the future. So that hasn't really changed all that much. I think in year 12, I briefly flirted with the idea of doing medicine, but quickly put that to the side once I realized that I probably didn't like blood and bodies and stuff. And then kind of settled. So my brother at the time was doing a finance degree, and talking to him was kind of a major influence in me wanting to go to the finance side. And actually the number one thing I wanted out of university was UNSW has this co-op program. It's called a finance co-op program, essentially, where you work alongside your studies. Like you get placed in these like big companies alongside your studies. And I did the interview for that, but wasn't successful in getting it. And at the time, that kind of felt like the end of the world, to be honest. Like, oh, here's this thing that would have set me up for life, and didn't manage to get it. And so then I still wanted to do the commerce thing, but then thought I'd combine it with a law degree. To be honest, it's because that's what everyone did, and it kind of used up my ATAR, which I think wasn't the right mindset at the time. But yeah, after all that, I kind of stumbled into UCID Com Law. Wasn't very happy with not getting into the co-op program, but I guess looking back now, it's kind of a silly thing to do because yeah, there's so many different options out there. Just to be hung up on this one program was probably not the best idea, but that's just how
Yeah.
my initial years
You,
of uni panned out.
yeah, 100%. And you brought up a good point there actually about using your ATAR. Like I
Yeah,
was like, for me, I know what you mean by that, and I
yeah,
definitely resonate with that. Can you explain that a bit more? And do you think other students sort of feel that same sort of compulsion?
yeah, definitely. So I think it is kind of like a societal pressure. So
Mm,
the way uni works in Australia, for those who might not be aware, excuse me, is yeah, courses have like a ATAR cutoff point. So you have to get above a certain ATAR, whether that be 95, 98,
mm,
whatever that may be, to get into that course. And so if you get a good ATAR, it often feels like you have to do those courses that have high cutoffs because it's kind of like, wow, these are the exclusive courses. So you kind of feel pressured to go in and do those. But I think that's flawed because ATARs don't actually reflect how ATAR cutoffs don't actually reflect how difficult that course is. It's just a supply and demand thing. The more a course is demanded compared to the supply of seats there are in that course, the higher the ATAR cutoff will be. And so it kind of becomes just like the ones that are seen as prestigious become the ones that have the highest cutoffs. And that kind of becomes like a self-reinforcing cycle. So yeah, in that sense, I kind of felt like I had to go into one of those high cutoff courses,
mm.
but it's an artificial thing.
Yeah, it's completely arbitrary, like let's be
Yeah.
honest, right? And I think, yeah, there isn't a lot of transparency about sort of ATAR cutoffs, to be honest with you.
Mm.
I haven't really thought of it that way, but that's a really, really good point you make. And I think a lot of other students, you might feel, would likely feel a similar way. So sort of, I wanted to jump to your university experiences. So as you mentioned, you initially went into uni studying a law degree, and then a couple of years down the line, you changed to commerce and advanced studies. So can you just tell us about your university experience? What was that like to you? Were you someone that really thrived in that sort of environment or find it challenging?
Yeah, I think took a couple of, or maybe a year probably to find my feet at university. So as you
Mm,
mentioned, I came in studying a commerce and law degree. And what I initially struggled with was in high school, everything's kind of given to you on a platter. Like your teachers will say, here's this specific assignment, here's the marking criteria, and kind of hound you to make sure that you get things in on time and do well. When uni, it's much more open. Like there'll be lectures you can attend if you want to, but no one's kind of pressuring you to go. So it's very easy to just not rock up to lectures. Assignments, like they'll be put up. You have to do them if you want to. Like no one will be emailing you saying, "Hey, this assignment is due in 2 days." So time management becomes very, very important. You have to become a lot more self-driven. So there was a little bit of an adjustment process for me there. But I think because in high school I had maintained that focus on academics, that transition was okay.
yeah.
The other thing was, yeah, just as we touched on earlier, just putting myself out there with like societies. So I joined like, finance societies, met new people, and that really helped make that transition easier. Just getting to know that there are other people who are also going through this new stage of life. And I guess an overall thing that kind of made it pretty easy was that I was still living at and still am living at home with my parents. So that kind of took one big stress away in terms of I didn't have to
Same here.
manage cooking and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I wanted to focus on something in particular you said, like, so just to be clear, you decided to transition from your law degree to the commerce and advanced studies at the end of year two, going into year three, was it?
Yeah, that's right. So a couple of years. So probably at the start of my second year of my law degree, I was kind of like, this subject isn't like this course isn't really interesting me. And if I'm
Mm,
not going to be a lawyer, is there a point in pursuing this law degree? I think the
mm,
argument people have in doing com law is that it opens your options up. Like people say, okay, you have a law degree, you kind of pass this smart test and you can do whatever you want after you graduate. I think there is some truth in that, but I think there's also a massive opportunity cost in doing a law degree if you're not going to be a lawyer, because you spend so much time doing readings, studying for exams, etc., that it eats away at doing things you would enjoy. And so I definitely found that happening. And so I
Mm.
took an elective in a subject called business analytics, which is part of the commerce degree at the time, which is more
Mm.
like a stats heavy quantitative type subject, which is something I enjoyed in high school, but kind of fell away during university. So seeing that, remembering that I really enjoyed the stuff and didn't like law that much, that kind of started the process of, hey, I think I might transition out. And then end of second year, I finally made that call. Wasn't an easy decision, but one that I'm super grateful that I made.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting the point you make there. And I was thinking of a lecturer I had last term at UNSW. We have terms, obviously,
Yeah.
and she was talking about the whole idea of sunk cost, right? And
Mm.
like she used the example of university students when they study a degree, right? And they might think that they've invested 1, 2, 3 years into their degree, but
Yeah.
in reality, it's a sunk cost, right? You can't
Yeah.
recover that. And
Exactly.
like her argument was that you should make decisions, disregarding those sunk costs because they've already happened and you can't recoup
Yeah.
them, right? And I think that
Yeah.
sort of goes to the point that you're making.
Yeah.
And do you sort of think that, at least in your experiences, do you think a lot of students have sort of continuing degrees that they're not really interested in, just because? Is that something that you think exists out there?
Yeah, definitely. It was something I was doing as well. I think I knew probably at the end of my first year that
Yeah.
I didn't like law, but
Mm.
kept at it. And I definitely read about sunk costs a lot, but I think it's very different when you're actually in that situation.
Yeah.
It's like, yes, I know theoretically I shouldn't be thinking, oh, I spent 2 years already in this law degree,
Mm.
and we should make the decision as if I'm starting from scratch. But just the human
It's internal
biases in
conflict.
terms of doing
Yeah.
that, it's hard, I think. But what made it good for me was my parents were very supportive. Like if they had been like, oh, I don't know, just continue with this, I might have honestly just stuck out with it. But they were very much like, okay, if you're not enjoying it, don't see using it, just drop it, change something else, change into
Yeah.
something else. I think that's the beauty of the system here as well, right? Like you're not locked into anything at any point. Like you
Mm.
could spend 4.5 years in law and then still drop it and choose and pick up something else along the way. Not saying I'd
Yeah.
recommend that, but the flexibility offered here is great.
Yeah, and I think flexibility is something that's also very relevant to sort of the tech startup and like the VC space as well, which we'll definitely get into later on.
Yeah.
So just to sort of cap off the university side of your experiences, sort of, you've touched on off air, about some of the experiences you've had at uni, whether it be some of the societies you've engaged in, or the going overseas on exchange to the US. Was there any sort of standout experiences that really appealed to you, and would you encourage other students to potentially consider those opportunities?
Yeah, definitely. I think university for me wasn't really about the piece of paper I'm going to get
Mm.
at the end. It was the number one, the people I met during my time there. And number two, the opportunities offered outside the classroom that wouldn't be offered, if I didn't go to university. And I think the number one was I went to Washington, D.C. through this industry placement program that USyd runs. And so what that was essentially an 9-week program where I was working and studying at the same time. And so while I was there, I was working at a congressman's office in a congressman from Illinois. And it was just a pretty alien world to me, like US politics, coming from like a 19-year-old Aussie that's never had like a proper job before. And the work itself wasn't, that meaningful. It was kind of like secretary, like not secretary, but like, answering phone
Admin,
calls,
yeah.
sending letters, taking complaints from constituents and passing them on to other people. Like the work itself wasn't that meaningful, but just being in that environment was awesome. And
Mm.
also it was my first time kind of, living alone, not alone. I had roommates, but living outside of home. So I had to learn to cook, to, clean, that kind of stuff, which was, I think, a good step in taking or in becoming independent. And then also, yeah, learning about the US Supreme Court and like racial politics in the US through the uni degree on the side was super interesting. I think that kind of experience would never have been offered if I didn't go to university. So that's definitely one that'll stay with me for a long time. And then the other one was, as you mentioned, more the student society
Yeah.
piece. Like I joined a couple of finance societies in my first year, 180 degrees consulting, which was kind of consulting with not-for-profits. And that experience was, again, good in building my soft skills, because in high school, I was very much in the books, but didn't have that, soft experience of talking to people, negotiating, that kind of thing. And that really helped develop.
And on the Washington, D.C. program, what's the sort of eligibility criteria? Can anyone join it? Is there a set of criteria you need to meet? Is it just for USyd students?
Yeah, it's just for USyd students. And
Yeah.
there is a pretty like rigorous interview process. So there was like a written application, video interview, like case study in real life kind of thing. And from that, they selected, I think it was like 15 people, and we all jetted off in January of 2018.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. I think that's something, if students are interested in that opportunity, they can definitely check it out. Another thing I wanted to highlight sort of was obviously your time with Textbook Ventures.
Yeah.
It was probably the thing that I wanted to learn more about through this interview. And I think I think from the outside looking in, it looks like it's something that's, been on the rise for a long time. It's gaining traction. So I definitely want to just spend a bit of time on that. So just to begin with, can you tell us a bit about sort of the purpose and vision behind Textbook Ventures?
Yeah, definitely. So the current kind of vision is to connect students with the startup and tech ecosystem in Australia. And we do that through three main channels. The first is events. The second is networking. And third is digital content. But I guess to take a step back, Textbook Ventures kind of started off as a student-run venture capital fund. So this was back in 2016. Two friends, David and Patrick, got together and thought, hey, maybe we could pull some money together as students and invest in student-run startups. And that kind of model was successful for some time. So they ran it for a couple of years like that. But as they moved on, the model kind of changed more into this community-driven model where we connect people with the startup space, or connect young people with the startup space. And so, yeah, in terms of some of the events we've run, for example, just this year we did like a venture capital case competition. So essentially got students to apply or gave them a case about 3 different startups and which one would you invest in and why. And then also we're running like a startup careers fair later on this year in October. Essentially 20 startups will get in a virtual room and students will have the chance to kind of interview. So that's kind of the flavor of what we do.
And is this just for USyd students as well?
No, so we're university agnostic. Anyone, you don't even really have to go to university to attend our events or read our content.
Okay. And for those that don't know, so you're the general manager. You were initially an events manager, but now you're the general manager of Textbook Ventures. Can you tell us a bit about like your specific responsibilities and like what you do within Textbook Ventures in that capacity?
Definitely. So yeah, as you mentioned, I started off in an events role. Yeah. What that involved was just like organizing the logistics around some of our events. Like, for example, we ran a careers fair in 2019 as well. So yeah, just managing the logistics around that. But over time, took on a bit more responsibility. And at the start of this year, took over that GM role. And essentially that's equivalent to, I guess, the president role in other societies that you might see. So essentially I'm leading the small team we have of, I think, 12 people now. Deciding the direction we want to take Textbook Ventures in, leading the team, setting tasks for everyone to do, delegating, that kind of thing, leading weekly meetings. So I think it's very much, I'm still very much hands-on. It's not like I'm just, delegating tasks and then sitting back. Still obviously involved with the podcast and involved in organizing events, but have taken on that additional responsibility of setting the overall direction and kind of guiding team members as well.
I mean, like for me, like having read a few of the material on the Textbook Ventures website and like the social pages, like the if correct me if I'm wrong, I want to definitely get your insights onto this, but it's sort of about like bridging the gap between like students, particularly in university, there might not be, and startups and entering the startup space. Is that sort of like the key sort of problem that Textbook Ventures is trying to solve? Or am I totally off there?
Yeah, no, spot on. So I think for university students, often like these corporate roles like investment banking, consulting are like the goals that people want to hit.
Hmm.
But the last couple of years, we've seen like a flourishing startup ecosystem come up in Australia. Like you see the Canvas, the Afterpays of the world, they're kind of the future. And we want university students to be more exposed to that, have opportunities in that space. And as you mentioned, be the bridge between students and the startup space.
And naturally creating those partnerships with those Australian startup and VC firms is really important as well. So Saurav, I wanted to talk about some of the challenges you faced in your role as GM. I think I was reading, it might have been an article that you wrote, but you talked about how you were doing a summer internship at the time you were in that role, and like things were getting a bit sort of chaotic and you were sort of struggling to manage your time and manage your priorities. Was that sort of the biggest sort of challenge for you, like managing all those different priorities whilst being like the GM of Textbook Ventures?
Yeah, I guess in general, time management is probably the main challenge. When I wasn't in a GM role, like things were quieter because, you know, I didn't need to have a view on everything that was going on in the society, just one little piece. And so once I took on the GM role, my responsibilities kind of ballooned. And as you mentioned, when I initially took on the role, I was in an investment banking internship, which, you know, is notorious for long hours. So I didn't really have the time to devote any thinking to Textbook Ventures. And that's gotten easier as I've, you know, moved into uni, but still definitely a challenge in terms of time. Other challenges I'd say would be at the start, I think I just try to do everything myself. I was a bit scared to delegate, I think, because I felt, you know, the buck stops with me. Maybe I'll just do this because, you know, I know what I'm doing and we'll just do it quickly. But I think that's definitely unsustainable. And something I've learned is just to bring other people into the fold, teach people, and then trust people to get things done. And then also what I struggled with initially and got feedback from the team was like clearly defining projects and setting like metrics throughout. So not just getting started blindly, but setting out a plan, getting people to agree on the plan, delegating responsibilities, and like writing that down somewhere clear. So yes, those are some of the things that I've learned so far.
So obviously a big part of Textbook Ventures is the podcast that you got up and running, Launch Codes. And for those that don't know, it's basically about showcasing and highlighting the stories of aspiring leaders in the tech startup and VC space. So for those that don't know what Launch Codes is, what can you tell us about Launch Codes and its purpose and sort of vision?
Yeah, so the purpose is very much in line with everything else we do at Textbook. It's kind of to shine a light on the startup and tech scene in Australia.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we've been tossing up the idea of a podcast for a while at Textbook, but I just, you know, decided it was time to execute. And so because of COVID, our events kind of didn't go through. It was a good gap that we had in our schedule. I kind of just, you know, bought this mic, interviewed our first guest, Alistair Coleman, who was a partner at a VC fund that we partnered with, Folklore. And it was received quite well. And that encouraged me, I guess, to keep going, interview more people, and yeah, keep shining a light on the stories of people in the tech space. I think there's a lot of I think people in the community really resonate with stories because they can see all the things they can do in the future. And so it was just a way of sharing those stories.
And at least from the interviews that I've seen, like you've interviewed a lot of young people in that space, and they don't really have a finished product yet. I say that respectfully. They're still building their careers, right? They're very young, right? And I think it's yeah, you often hear in media, you just generally, you often hear about people, you hear about the success stories, right? When the finished product. So I think it's really refreshing to hear about people who are like in the trenches trying to carve out their careers in that space. And I think, with these conversations, I think, I try to reflect a similar sort of sentiment.
Yeah.
So to date, sort of, you've recorded around 14 or 15 interviews. Obviously, you've canvassed a diverse range of people. Just out of my own curiosity, I wanted to understand, like, did you find that as a host of the podcast that people were saying similar things? Were they trying to get like consistent themes and messages across to young people? Or was it just totally random and totally diverse to that end?
Yeah, no, good question. I think one that has been really common is everyone encourages you to take risks, especially early in your career. There's this, I guess, dogma around going to university for 4 to 5 years and then going into a corporate job. But I guess by virtue of being in the startup and tech scene, a lot of these guests have recommended that when you're in your 20s, it's the time to try different things, try to start a company, join a scrappy startup, because let's say the startup fails, you can always go back to the corporate route if you want to. But let's say you spend 5-6 years in a corporate, maybe then then life sort of happens along the way. Like you start a family, you get responsibilities kind of thing. And it's harder to take those risks in the future. And I think Alistair, our first guest, said, you're not really going to have a failure unless you have a failure of ethics or a failure of values. And I found that really insightful. Like another way I've heard it put is that there's a difference between job risk and career risk. And so a lot of people think startups are risky. And so on that job risk and career risk point, at a startup, your job risk is quite high, meaning that there's a risk that your company is going to fail and your job is going to vanish. But your career risk, which is the risk of your career falling apart, is very low, because even if the startup fails, there'll always be a story you can tell in the future of saying, how to what you did when things got tough, how you took part in challenges. And so startups aren't really that risky. So that kind of whole risk point is something that's been mentioned quite a lot. And then the other thing that's been a theme, again, I think by virtue of these people being in the startup scene, is just how excited they are about the Aussie tech scene. Like we're seeing a lot of hallmarks of, tech hubs overseas, like, the Silicon Valleys of the world that are now being replicated in Australia, like this really tight circle of startup operators and investors. For example, you might have seen the news recently, Canva, which is like a design startup, has recently been valued at, I think, over $50 billion, which is more than Telstra. So we're seeing this
Really?
real swell of interest in startups and in tech in Australia. And everyone I've interviewed has been super excited about that.
You brought up a good point there about how, I suppose, people in the startup space might attract a certain type of people who aren't necessarily risk averse and who might be comfortable with a degree of risk and uncertainty. Yeah. So I bring up that point to sort of bring up a broader point about, like in your experience interviewing these people, do you find that, granted, it's a small sample size, but do you find that the startup space attracts a certain type of people, whether it be like a certain type of characteristics, skills, where they come from, what uni they attended, or is it totally random in your experience?
Yeah, good question. As you mentioned, it is a small sample size. I've strived so far to get a diversity of guests on board, like people who've had different career paths, different nationalities, kind of thing. So hard to pick a certain characteristics, but I would say they are probably less averse to taking risks, probably by virtue of being in the startup space. It's kind of it is a more quote unquote risky endeavor than going into a corporate. But also I've spoken to a lot of people that started off in corporates and then went into the startup space and have realized that, hey, it's not that much more risky than this stable job. I think you just have to do your diligence on the startups you're getting into. But yeah, overall, I wouldn't say there's like one or two qualities that really stand out.
And I think that's a point in and of itself, to be honest with
Yeah.
you. You've already mentioned about how you got Launch Codes up and running, and you've sort of synthesized the key lessons you've learned along the way into an article called "How to Start a Podcast from Your Bedroom," which you published on your Medium. Having started a podcast myself, obviously, I didn't know the first thing about like starting a podcast. I think I've upgraded my mic. As I said, it's a bit overkill, but I didn't know, what equipment you needed, what software, how to conduct an interview, how to source guests, and I found a lot of those questions were answered through that article. And I encourage people who are trying to start a similar project to definitely take a look at it. So in that article, you talked about an 8-step roadmap for people starting their podcast journey. I won't put you on the spot and ask you to talk about each step,
Yeah.
but can you just tell us a bit about that article generally, and what were some of the sort of key like messages you were trying to get across to people?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess I'll start with the motivation for writing it. And it was, I read this book called Show Your Work by Austin Kleon. He's a blogger in the US. And the whole premise of that book is to put your work online, basically. So if there's any skill that you have, there's no real value in holding that close to your chest. You should help other people learn to do this, learn to be good at the skill that you have. And the more you do that, the more you put yourself out there, you build kind of this brand equity against your own name. And that allows you to leverage that in the future, whether that be starting a long form blog, starting a YouTube channel, whatever that may be. And yet again, don't be selfish with the things share that with the world and you'll create value. And so looking at that, I said, hey, what's the skill that I picked up recently that I wasn't really good at, say, 6 months ago? And this podcast was pretty much top of the list. So I thought, hey, why don't I just talk about my process? In that way, I'll refine what I already know and also maybe help someone start a podcast. And who knows, that podcast might go on to do great things. And so that was, the premise for writing it. The other takeaway would be generally for side projects, a good piece of advice I heard recently was don't learn, then start then learn. So don't spend time, doing hours of research into how to start a podcast. What's the best equipment I need? It's better to just pull out even like your phone, get in a room with someone you want to have a conversation with and record that and publish it, and then learn, get feedback on that, learn, fix your mistakes and keep building that way rather than spending hours just in motion, but not actually taking action.
Did you fall into that trap at the beginning of sort of overthinking? Because I definitely did.
Yes, 100%. So I was kind of like, oh, who should I interview? Made like a guest of, made like an Excel sheet with like 20 guests and like, oh, maybe this one, maybe that one. What questions should I ask? Made like a list, took out 10 questions, added 15 questions in. And once you're in that conversation, it's just very different, right? Yeah. So it's better to just, get the ball rolling, get started, then get good.
100%. I think that's valuable advice, not only if you're starting a podcast, but any sort of passion project as well.
Anything.
100%. So in the interest of time, I wanted to pivot a little bit and talk about, I suppose, almost the antithesis of that, which is sort of your corporate experience in investment banking and consulting. So can you just tell us a bit about those opportunities and how they came across your lap first and foremost?
Yeah, I guess I am a bit of a hypocrite. Like I preach a lot of this startup
and
tech stuff, but then no, it's something I definitely recognize myself, and it's kind of like a duality, I have. Like the experience I've had has been a lot more towards the corporate side, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So I guess that started off in my third year of university. So I landed an internship at a company called Visagio, which is like a management consulting firm. They're a Brazilian firm, but opened up offices in Australia recently. So that was a really great experience because I was, hands-on with the client, Pacific National, and really, again, got to develop my soft skills. And I think really enjoyed consulting. And then I also was at Deloitte for a summer. And then more recently, so this summer, so January 2021, I had an investment banking role at UBS. Yeah, is there? Would you like me to speak about that further, or is there a
Yeah,
particular track you want to take?
I wanted to talk about something you actually mentioned off air about sort of like glorifying these opportunities and sort of consulting and investment banking. Do you think that's something that a lot of students sort of have as well? And was that something you sort of resonate with?
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, investment banking in particular was kind of like this hallowed turf almost.
Yeah.
Like my brother was in investment banking, and it kind of seemed like the place to be. Like a lot of my friends were also um, very eager in getting into banking. And I think I'm glad that I went the summer internship route instead of going straight into a grad role, because while it was a good experience in terms of I learned heaps, got exposure to some very cool like deals that were going on. I was in the infrastructure team at UBS. I got to learn about like solar energy, uh, wind energy, like even niche things like toll roads. It was just like a cool learning experience. But lifestyle wise, it was pretty tough. Like working, 16, 17 hours a day, like 5, 6 days a week. For me personally, it wasn't sustainable. I think there's other things you could be doing with your time that you can also learn heaps with. Yeah, definitely glad I did the experience, but there is, I think, a sense of glorification around those type of careers. For better or for worse, that's just how it is at the moment.
100%. I think a lot of people will definitely resonate with that idea of, I mean, like burnout, things like burnout, like mental health issues, anxiety, like are all associated with some of those roles. Not to say that it's obviously not for some people, but it's definitely good to be aware of those things.
Yeah.
So sort of, I just wanted to ask as well, like you talked about, performing well in these sort of like entry level sort of summer intern sort of roles. What really helped you succeed in those roles, and what advice might you give to someone who might be entering their sort of first internship or summer analyst role, for example?
Yeah, great question. I think the one piece of advice is it's not about what you know, it's more about your attitude. So as an intern, no one expects you to know pretty much anything. It's just you have to come in as a blank slate and be ready to put your hand up for opportunities and be enthusiastic. So seniors aren't going to expect you to whip up like a DCF model in Excel in 2 hours. They'll expect you to ask questions, take on advice that they have, and demonstrate that you're eager and also willing to build on your mistakes. So if I had to give one piece of feedback, that would be it. Like it's your attitude that's really important. Other things, I would say I would get really nervous before starting new internships, because it's like, oh, I have to really perform, can't make mistakes, I have to be perfect. You don't have to be perfect. Like you will make mistakes. There's no getting around that. You will screw up at some point. It's more about how you bounce back from that and demonstrate to your seniors that you won't make the same mistake multiple times. You'll learn and grow from that. So don't get caught up in this idea of having to be perfect. And then the last thing I'll say is it's again not always about the work, it's about the relationships you build as well. So take schedule in a coffee chat with your seniors or even people outside your team, just to kind of get your name out there, show that you're once again enthusiastic. And also it kind of works the other way, because internships, they're kind of interviewing you, but you're also interviewing the firm. So if you talk to other people in the firm and say, you know what, like their experience doesn't actually sound that cool, you know that, okay, this isn't for me, I'll try something else. So it's not always about them judging you. You should also judge the firm.
100%. And throughout this interview, Saurav, we've touched on a few of the articles that you've wrote and published on Medium. As I mentioned, I've maxed out my sort of free articles views. Do they replenish, by the way, or am I just stuck with that forever?
No, you're not stuck for life. I think they replenish monthly.
That's good news. That's good news.
Yeah.
So in those articles, they're really interesting first and foremost, and I'll definitely leave the relevant link to those articles, because I think there's a lot of value that students can find in there. I just wanted to ask first and foremost, like, what is it about writing these articles that really appeal to you? Was it something about the creative process? Did you really resonate with that, or was it something else that really attracted you to writing those articles?
Yeah, I think the main reason I initially started was to kind of structure my thoughts. So I'd read a lot of books, for example, but like read about cool ideas, but never
Mm.
kind of solidify them in my mind. And I found that a great way to actually structure your thoughts was by writing them down, because once you do that, you force yourself to structure your thoughts in a way that has to be communicated well to someone else. And when you're communicating something to someone else, you're also kind of communicating it to yourself. So I found that really helped to solidify ideas. And so, for example, the first article I wrote was not the first, but the first kind of successful one was, it was called 8 Useful Mental Models. And it was kind of a list of this concept called mental models, which is a way to structure your thoughts and kind of see different patterns in the world and apply that over and over again. And so I wrote about things like the 80-20 rule, like 20%, 80% of your results will come from 20% of the work. Or another one I wrote about in that article was the idea of compounding, which is things like the work you do is never kind of linear. It's always kind of exponential, like small little steps, and then things start compounding. Finance students might know of compound interest, like interest earns interest, and that I guess applies to your work and habits as well. Things build over time rather than just being linear. So yeah, long story short, I took up writing to structure my thoughts, and also through Medium, you get, depending on how many paid members engage with your work, you get like a monthly payout as well. And so that 8 Useful Mental Models article did really well. And in 1 month, I got like, I think it was like $200. I was like, whoa, this is crazy. Like
Yeah.
people are actually reading my work and I'm getting paid for it. That was kind of a little dopamine hit that continued, like encouraged me to keep going. Yeah, exactly. The earnings haven't been anything like that since then, but I definitely still enjoy the process.
100%. And one of the articles that really stood out to me, sorry, was the one called 8 Quotes to Live By. That's different to the eight
Yeah,
one
seems
you
like I
mentioned
just love the
earlier.
number 8. Yeah.
Yeah. So in that article, like you sort of talked about a similar principle about articulating your thoughts into this sort of central location. And I think the idea came from, was it Ryan Holiday's book and that
Yeah.
commonplace idea? I was
Yeah.
wondering if you could sort of expand on that a bit more, because I think we can all, at least for me, I get swept up in trying to read as many books as I can, and I couldn't tell you what half the things in those books are, or like
Yeah.
the key principles. So could you speak to that approach you took?
Yeah, definitely. I think as I mentioned in that article, a problem I'd have is, as you mentioned, read a lot of things,
Mm.
but not retain a lot of it. And I was kind of looking for ways to overcome that. And I came across this idea of a commonplace book from Ryan Holiday. And what that is you basically categorize or you make various categories like relationships, success, life lessons, history, so on and so forth. And every time you read something interesting that falls under one of those categories, you note it down. So that could be in a notebook, it could be in a digital platform, like I use Evernote, for example. And then over time, under each of those categories, you build like a whole list of different concepts and principles in a short form under each of those categories. And then whenever you get time, you can just flick through your notes, and like just that, getting that repeated exposure kind of puts stuff in your head. And so I found that to be, yeah, a really great asset in terms of remembering what I've read, and also helps me a lot in my writing,
Mm.
because if I want to talk about a concept, I just flick to the relevant page in my Evernote, and the things that I would never have remembered about that concept will be there from the first time I read them.
Mm.
And yeah, so in that sense, I would definitely recommend everyone to kind of have this commonplace book. But again, I think you don't really need to take that too far. I think reading, it doesn't have to be kind of that transactional process where you have to remember everything you read. I think reading in and of itself is a great activity, because you spend your time kind of walking through someone else's thoughts that they've put down on the page. Yeah, I think what I was saying was, it's kind of cool to think you're reading like, especially if you're reading a book from ages ago, you're reading the thoughts of someone who lived 2000 years ago, and their words are still irrelevant today. So yeah, I wouldn't say that you have to remember everything you read, but this complex book is a good way to get started.
And as we approach the end of this interview, I think my brother's just turned on the shower behind me, so hopefully we can still hear me.
Yes.
But so we're pretty much at the end of the interview. So I just wanted to talk about one last sort of general and open-ended question. Like, as you mentioned there, you've collated a lot of the ideas you've read and principles you've read in books into this Evernote commonplace book, right? So just as a final question, was there a particular idea or principle that you really wanted to get across to students and that you think that students will find a lot of benefit and value in? You might have mentioned it previously throughout the interview, but just a last opportunity to sort of get that message across.
Yeah, definitely. I might cheat and talk about two. So the first one is be patient in the macro, but impatient in the micro. Right. And so what that means is, I guess a lot of us get caught up in these long-term goals, like, hey, in 5 years, I want to have X job and be earning this much. But today we kind of put things off, like we'll do whatever we want, don't really focus on, getting good at one thing in particular. So I think rather than having lofty goals, I think it's better to be really impatient with what you're doing today, like work really hard on outputting a lot of content, trying a lot of things, seeing what you're good at, and then seeing where that takes you rather than setting this lofty goal and trying to get there somehow. I think another way I've heard that was, for example, I recently read Atomic Habits by James Clear, and he said, you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. And what that means is your systems are essentially like the everyday things you do, the small steps you take that make you 1% better. And so those are actually the things that will determine your success in the long term. So yeah, in short, focus on what you're doing today rather than what you want to be doing 10 years down the track. And then the other thing was the perfect is the enemy of the good. And what that means is we get caught up in trying to achieve perfection in everything we want to achieve. Like, well, as you were talking about with the podcast earlier, research the best guests, the best questions to ask, but then maybe not even get started. The better way to do it is to get started, then get good at something. So don't aim for perfection every time. Put together a product you might not be happy with, put it out into the world, get feedback, then improve. And that applies to any kind of side project or even main project you're doing.
100%. So on that note, I think that really sort of reflects sort of the central themes of this interview. And for me, I think there's a lot of benefit that students can derive from this interview. And I think, for me, it's interesting how you never really got sort of stuck on something that you didn't really like. And I think, that might be underplayed and it might just be glanced over, but I think that's really important because, hearing you talk about your experiences, you've been very open-minded to new opportunities. And you've pivoted where things didn't pique your interest. And I think that might sound like a cliche or like something that's a cliche basically. But I think that's really, really important for students to hear. And it's interesting to talk about, some of the things you've done with Textbook Ventures, Launch Codes, the articles you've written on Medium as well. I think there's, again, like so much value that students can get from those articles and pieces of content. And a lot of the principles that you've talked about throughout the interview, like you haven't just talked about it, you've applied them throughout whatever it is that you're doing. So on that note, Saurav, thank you so much for your time today. It is early in the morning as well, so I appreciate your time coming onto the podcast.
No worries. Thanks a lot. Had a lot of fun. And do you mind if I just throw that one of the questions you asked back to you, which was key principles that you asked me, are there any key principles that podcast guests often repeatedly talk about? Have you found that to be the case in your podcast guests? Yeah.
100%. And I think like some people might say it's repetitive, but I think it's good to hear it from different people who've had different experiences. like one of the key things that a lot of people say, as you touched on today, is that because the people I interview are students, students operate in a very low risk environment. And I think that's really important. And I think realizing that opens up a lot of opportunities for students. And I think the other thing that a lot of people say is that just put yourself out there. As much as you can get caught up in what other people might think of what you're doing, in reality, people will be surprised that you're doing a particular project, you're writing these articles, putting out these podcasts, but over time, people who are naturally attracted to what you're doing will stay along for the ride, and people who aren't interested will just fall off, right?
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
that puts things into perspective, right? And it makes you realize that you're not the center of the world, right?
Yeah.
And I think those are two things that students, that's a consistent message that students try to get across through these interviews. And it's something that I personally resonate with as well. And I try to reflect in these interviews. So it's the first time, someone actually asked me a question back, Saurabh. So we're covering new territory, but I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, good. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think I always had a fear of putting myself out there because the fear was, what will other people think of me? But
100%.
Like, ask yourself, when you've read something, have you ever thought, is this guy such a loser? He's putting his thoughts, or he's doing a podcast, or he's like, you've never thought that when reading someone else's work, right? So I think that little perspective shift really helped me and kind of, encouraged me to put myself out there as well.
Yeah.